Hello. This is What If Luffy Was the Son of Whitebeard. Please like and subscribe to my channel and check out the author and the fanfiction linked in the description. 15 likes for the next part, enjoy. Luffy, he needs help first. She said as he chuckled lightly. That's what he said about you, Miss Yoi. Standing up he looked at her, their eyes locking blue to a warmer brown than Luffy's, but he could see the fire in them had not dulled from the sickness she was battling. I was asked by my son to take you to a doctor and that I will do, but I should let the doctor know as well that she'll have 2 patients coming her way. That old witch doesn't like surprises, Yoi. He said looking out the window and rubbing the back of his head. Luffy is my captain, our captain, he comes first before all, she said trying to sit up, but the fever too high to let her get far as she collapsed back into the bed. I know, trust me I know. Marco said because even though he was being a calm adult he truly was panicking on the inside. Having lived a long life had taught him that panicking didn't solve anything, and right now Luffy and this girl needed him to be as calm as possible. I'll be back as soon as I can, Yoi. He said carefully to her as she closed her eyes, once again the fever too much for her to handle. Where are you going? A long-nosed man asked as Marco closed the door behind him. There's a doctor on this island who can and will help, but showing up without letting her know what's happening first can slow down their healing even faster. The sooner I let her know you'll be coming, the better, Yoi. He told them as the long-nosed man nodded, slowly taking everything in, but Marco could see that each and every one of these teenagers were tired and just wanted this to be over with. How far away is this doctor? Zoro asked, closing Luffy's door silently, letting Marco know that the boy was probably sleeping, which stirred his emotions. I'm faster in the air than I am on the ground, I'll be there and back as fast as I can. Don't move them at all until I return, Yoi. He said, giving orders as if these people were not a whole other crew but siblings under his division. We don't plan to move them anywhere. Sanji said, standing a distance away from Zoro, but there was a bond there between the two, even if they didn't know it quite yet. Without another word Marco ran to the deck, returning back to his phoenix form and flying as fast as his arms would let him to Korea. Landing on her windowsill he didn't even bother to return back to his human form but tapped the glass with his beak, threatening to break it if she didn't answer him soon. Calm down, Feathers. She said in a low tone that told him she was annoyed. My brother and his navigator are sick and I'll be bringing them to you shortly, please help them, Yoi. He yelled in her face, the panic he had been holding back on the small ship bubbling to the surface. Korea looked at him carefully, her sunglasses holding back her long hair, a frown pulling her lips downwards as she took in his panicked expression. Here, drink this. She walked away from the window and returned swiftly with a small bottle of black liquid. I don't have time, I need to get back now, Yoi. He said, ready to take off, but her hand grabbed his winged arm, turning it back into a normal arm. If you go down there panicking like this it will make my job harder. This stuff here will calm you down enough to get through the day. He transformed back into his human form, but his eyes were on the hand that had stopped his fruit powers from working. How did you do that, Yoi? He asked her as she held up her hand, showing a series of rings as a smirk began to play on her face. Sea stone comes in handy when dealing with people like you. She laughed while pushing the little bottle into his hand. Bottoms up, Feathers. She smiled, but he took one last look at her hand before opening the bottle and drinking the contents down quickly. It didn't taste bad, but it really wasn't that great either, but the calming effects it had begun to work almost instantly. What bothered him about her rings was the fact that sea stone had a nice way of draining him of all his energy and willpower, but when she grabbed his arm he didn't feel that way. It clearly didn't feel like hockey, and even users who don't blacken their hands with armament tended to give this vibe of hockey, this didn't. Those look like serious thoughts, but isn't your brother waiting for you? She asked him, amusement shining through. Luffy? He almost yelled, remembering why he had come to her in the first place. Chopper. Prepare 2 beds for our new guests. They will probably be staying a while. She said as her student came into the room cautiously and nodded, going to do what was asked of him. Marco returned to his phoenix form and jumped away from the window, flying as fast as he could back towards the small ship. What took you so long? The long-nosed guy asked, annoyance in his voice, but Zoro walked beside him, placing a hand on the man's shoulder, stopping him. I can take one up at a time, the doctor will be expecting them shortly, Yoi. He said as the crew nodded and began to move into action. The safest way to bring them would be for me to take them up separately, Yoi. He said as Sanji nodded, leading Marco to the girls' room. Nami Swan is weaker than Luffy right now. He said sadly, but Marco looked at the girl carefully. Wrap her up as much as you can, Yoi. He said as he moved towards the bed and very carefully picked the girl up, letting the blonde wrap the blankets around her, not asking questions if it helped save her life. Once she was wrapped in the blankets, Marco carried her ever carefully out onto the deck and placed her down gently. What are you doing? Sanji asked, looking at Nami, who looked to be in slight pain. Bringing her to a doctor, Yoi. With that he transformed back into his phoenix form and with his talons, picked the girl up and flew as fast as he could towards the Drum Mountains to deliver the witch doctor her first patient. Marco placed her down carefully on the floor of the castle as Kariha and her student came out to collect their patient. She has a high fever and is very close to death. Marco didn't even flinch when the creature had changed its form and picking the girl up. "You can do something though, right, Yoi?" he asked looking at his old friend. "What she has is an old disease that's been gone for a really long time," she said to Marco who just froze his eyes never leaving hers. "You're lucky they chose to come here since I know how to cure it," she said slowly to Marco who took in her words. Marco and the others all knew Luffy had some sort of luck on his side when it came to things. Kariha was silently telling Marco that luck doesn't last forever. "I'll be back with my brother. Is there any way for the rest of the crew to come to the castle so I don't have to make so many trips, Yoi?" The creature had returned catching the end of the conversation. "There's a rope we take down to the village, which should work, right?" he asked becoming more and more timid as Marco's attention was drawn to him. "Bring the other brat and his crew to the rope. From there they can all climb up while you fly with the boy," she said waving her hand letting Chopper know to show Marco where the rope was. "This means a lot to me, Yoi," he said to her as she shook her head at him. "Save the sentiment until I've saved your brat's feathers," she scoffed as Marco smiled following behind the creature towards a rope attached to the mountain. "This will take you down to the old house Doctorine lived in before," the creature said to Marco who thanked him before returning once again to his phoenix form and flying back to the small ship. "You took your time," Zoro said his arms crossed and his jaw set annoyance clear in his eyes. "Sorry, but I can't fly you all up the mountain, so I had to find another way to get you up there as well, Yoi," he replied knowing that everyone was on edge. "What do you mean mountain?" the long-nosed boy asked as Marco pointed to the Drum Mountain where he had brought the girl earlier. "Look, I don't really have the time or energy to explain this all to you, Yoi," he said his brow twitching because he really needed to get Luffy to the doctor fast. "Can you trust me?" he asked them looking them over carefully as they visibly relaxed a bit. "Of course, please show us the way," Vivi said as Marco smiled softly at the girl before rushing towards Luffy's room to gather his precious little brother. "You've never done well with sickness, have you, Yoi?" Marco asked picking him up with his blankets much like he did the girl. "I'll need you to follow me," he said to them but was stopped as Zoro held his arms out confusing Marco. "Give Luffy to me, I'll carry him part of the way then you the rest. You transform into whatever type of bird that is, but if you're carrying him you might drop him in your transformation. Luffy will be safe with me, I promise," Zoro said as Marco hesitated for a moment before passing the sleeping teenager over to his first mate. "Quickly now, follow me, Yoi," he said turning away from the group and leading them into the forest where the old witch used to live. "See this rope? It leads up to the castle. I know it's a long way and a dangerous route, but it's the best I have for you to get there. The girl is already being taken care of, but Luffy needs to get there as soon as possible, so I wish you luck, Yoi." Turning towards the green-haired man who had carried Luffy carefully in his arms the entire way through the snow and trees, a moment passed between the two men. Both were fiercely protective of the straw-hatted boy and cared about his well-being more than any. "We're counting on you," Zoro said unknowingly repeating the blonde boy Sanji's words from earlier as he placed Luffy on the snow, gently letting Marco turn back into the phoenix once again. Grabbing Luffy with his golden talons making a loud call in response to the crew, he flew the boy to the waiting doctor. "So what are we waiting for? Let's climb this rope and get to our crew." X. When Luffy opened his eyes he realized slowly that he wasn't on his ship anymore and that brought a surge of panic in his veins. "Relax Lu, you're safe, Yoi." Marco had begun to push the boy back down after he bolted upright in bed suddenly. "My crew, Nami, where I need," he tried to all get out at once, but his mind was jumbled up making it hard for him to find the right words to speak. "They're safe, resting but safe," Marco reassured him, but Luffy wasn't having any of it as he began to remove blankets from around him and get out of bed only for a small surgical knife to fly past his face becoming lodged into the wall. "Did I give you permission to get out of bed?" the doctor asked her hand on her hip sunglasses covering her eyes and a frown on her face. "My crew, my friends I need to." Luffy once again tried to get out only this time she stepped aside letting a crying Usopp run and jump to him. "Luffy?" he cried tears pouring down his face and snot dangling from his nose. "I thought you were going to die," he cried harder as Luffy looked him over before a soft look came over his face. "Don't be stupid, like I'd die from a fever," he said patting Usopp on the head. The boy cried into his captain's lap. "Still, don't scare us like that." Zoro was leaning against the wall looking at the pair fondly. "Sorry, Nami is she," he began, but Zoro held up a hand. "She's about as well as you are and you're not on 100%. Vivi's with her now talking, so why not let them be and get some rest? I think that's what your brother wants." Zoro said, bringing Luffy's attention back to Marco, who was feeling a little left out of the moment. You almost died, brat. Another day or two and even my remedies might not have been able to save you. The doctor said to Luffy, who laughed at her, brushing the fact he could have died off. As long as Nami's alright now, I'm okay. He said cheerfully, which caused Marco to restrain himself from yelling at his brother. Nah, do you guys mind if I talk with Luffy for a while, Yoi? Marco asked as the doctor sighed, leaving the brothers alone, and Zoro detached Usopp from Luffy's lap, pulling him out of the room, closing the door behind him, but not before looking back at Luffy. What's up? Luffy asked. The fact that Marco was here was starting to settle in, bringing a warm feeling to his heart. What's up is that I've been looking for you, and when I finally find you, you're dying from a fever, Yoi. Marco sighed, placing his head in his hands, taking a deep breath. I'm alright now, I promise. Luffy said softly to Marco, who looked up at him quickly, his eyes a little red from either lack of sleep or holding his emotions in. Luffy, do you realize just how much you mean to me, Yoi? His tone told Luffy a lot more than those words spoken to him. About as much as you mean to me, ma. He said softly as Marco chuckled softly but quietly. Then why do you like to worry me so much? I've been following your adventures, wondering if I should have ever let you out of my sight, Yoi. He confessed, which made Luffy give a sheepish grin. But you never came to drag me home. He laughed as Marco locked eyes with him. Trust me, boy, I've been so tempted, Yoi. He said, letting a short silence to fall around them. Why were you looking for me? I know you said you've been following my adventure, but if you wanted me to come home, you could have done that easily. He looked at his ma hard now, trying to figure out why he was really here. One of the things I love most about you, Lu, is your perceptiveness. You're right, if I wanted you home, that is where you'd be, crew and all, if I needed to, Yoi. He said as Luffy nodded. But I'm not home, so. You're not, because I'm looking for someone else, Yoi. A look of confusion and curiosity came across Luffy's face at those words. I'm looking for Teach. At those small words, Luffy's eyes widened and narrowed. It's been years, why now? He asked, his voice low. We believe he wants power, Lu, and for some reason or another he's targeting you, Yoi. Marco watched Luffy as he took in those words and thought about them. I've got a strong crew watching my back, ma. I don't really need you and Pops protecting me all the time. He said carefully, but Marco could hear a slight anger in his voice. Lu, we've watched you take on enemies your whole life and never really stepped in. Marco began, but Luffy gave him a look and clearly said seriously. Never really stepped in much, Yoi. He corrected himself after that look. Teach was strong enough to not just injure, but nearly kill Thatch. He also made an attack on one of Pop's islands, killing a few of our brothers, Yoi. He told Luffy, whose eyes widened. His heart hurt for the commander that lost some of his division and Pops, who lost some sons. Why me though? He asked quietly, pulling the blankets up a bit, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold of the island. Because he's one of the few who were there the day you were given to us, Lu. He knows your history, your past, and with that knowledge he can hurt you or us, Yoi. Luffy looked away from Marco, thoughts racing through his head. What will you do when you find him? He finally said after a moment's silence. I'll do what we should have done all those years ago, Luffy. I'll kill him, Yoi. Marco didn't sugarcoat his words. If Luffy was a real captain, now he knew death happened to those who attacked family. Taking a deep breath, Luffy looked at Marco once again, a small smile on his pale face. Be safe. The words Luffy always spoke to Marco whenever he left for a mission caused Marco to put his hand on the boy's head and mess his hair up more. Always, Lu. Standing up and stretching, Marco smiled down at the not-so-little boy in the bed. Get some rest, kid. You've got a good crew who depends on you to be your strongest, Yoi. He said to Luffy, who let his small smile stretch across his face. They're special, aren't they? They're my family after all. Which then makes them mine as well. Leaving the boy in the room all alone, Luffy looked out the window, his smile fading into a frown, his eyes hardening as he took in his reflection. I'm not a kid anymore, I won't let you hurt my family this time. He whispered before lying back down and closing his eyes, letting the darkness fill his vision, drifting off to an unpleasant sleep. X. When Luffy woke up again, a weird creature was checking his temperature, while a cold thing on his chest seemed to be listening to his heartbeat. What the, he said quietly, alerting the creature that Luffy was in fact awake, causing it to jump back and away from him. Human, you seem to be doing better, it said to Luffy, trying to hide, but failing badly. Man, I feel a lot better now. He said as the thing looked at him cautiously before letting go of the wall. Did you take your medication Doctorine left for you? He asked, a shake in his voice as he took one step closer and stopped. Can't remember, he said honestly, causing the creature to sigh. I'll have to ask the doctor if she knows the answer. Then Luffy looked at the creature carefully, taking in its horns and features. Nah. What are you? He finally asked, since he couldn't seem to place a word for the thing. I'm a reindeer, you idiot. It shouted at him as Luffy's eyes widened, looking him over once more before a huge smile came across his face. Rain-chan, he said, looking at the creature, the memory of an old faded toy resurfacing in his mind. My name's Chopper. It shouted at him, not liking the nickname he had just given him. Chopper, Luffy said, smiling at the name. I like it. Nah, you're pretty cool looking. He said as Chopper came closer to his bed, now a sense of trust coming off of Luffy. My father gave it to me, he said rather carefully, looking at Luffy, now the shyness returning. My father gave me my name as well, I think, he said, not really knowing. You should be sleeping more. I'll go find out if you've had your medicine yet, so don't go anywhere. Chopper said, getting up slowly, his eyes locked onto Luffy's face. Right, I'll stay here. He said, smiling as Chopper left the room, and from the shadows came the old witch lady. Boy, it's you. I think the Chopper guy was about to go find you. He said to her as she eyed him, a small frown on her face. You're planning on taking my student away from me, aren't you? She wasn't one to beat around the bush. He's cool, I like him. Luffy admitted, glad she got to the point fast. His heart has been broken, his spirit beaten down. Do you think you can heal those scars from his past? She asked him. I can try, can't I? He said to her, a smirk on his face, brown eyes shining as she looked at him harder before giving a smile of her own, turning away. You're very much like her, whether that is good or not is still a mystery to me. She said, mostly to herself, confusing Luffy a whole lot. Like who? He tilted his head in confusion at her, but she was already walking away. Ah, whatever. He said, brushing her words aside and jumping out of bed, even though he knew he wasn't supposed to. Walking to the window, Luffy looked out. A weird shape seemed to be racing towards the castle he was in. That looks interesting, he thought out loud as a few others noticed the creature coming quickly towards where they were. What's that? Vivi asked, looking out the window in Nami's room, making the Redeed shift herself so that she could see as well. Looks like trouble. She sighed, knowing trouble seemed to follow close behind them no matter where they went. It's Chopper, said by the doctor. The little guy began to shake as his eyes widened in terror at the sight of who was coming towards them. So the king has returned, huh? Kuriha snickered, looking at the creature, or rather person, with a bit of humor in her eyes, even though her student was afraid of the man. The king? Didn't he abandon this country, Yoi? Marco asked the witch, who nodded. Ran away when we were attacked, but Wapol has always been a coward. She said casually as Marco eyed the creature, his eyes darkening and a small smile crossing his face. So you wouldn't mind if I had some fun, would you, Yoi? He asked calmly, but Kuriha had known the man long enough to know he was looking for a fight. You want to fight, Wapol? Chopper asked in marvel at the man, who looked down at the creature with his eyes still darkened. I've got a lot of pent-up frustration, and this king sounds like just the exercise I need to feel better, Yoi. Yes, Marco had just had a really long few days taking care of his sick brother and crewmate. The cowardly king was exactly what he needed to feel more relaxed, that and a perfectly healthy Luffy. But he'll take beating up a crappy king if need be. Shall we greet him? It's only polite to welcome the king home, Yoi. Luffy is sick. Luffy is sick. Luffy is sick. Luffy was sick. All of that went through Marco's brain as he opened the front doors of the castle, his blue eyes colder than the snow blowing in his face. I'd ask you to keep your voice down, but I don't think you know how, Yoi. Marco said, catching the attention of the weird-looking man who was riding what looked like a fuzzy hippo. And who might you be, huh? He asked Marco, who was unusually calm, a small smile curling from his lips. Just a frustrated pirate who nearly lost his son. I'm told you aren't much liked here, Yoi. He said casually, but the tick mark appearing on the man's face almost made Marco laugh. And why is a pirate living in my castle? By the order of the king, this is a disgrace, and your sentence is death. He yelled. His minions, or friends, Marco wasn't sure, smiled, stepping forward. Honestly, I was just hoping to let off steam, but this doesn't look like it'll help at all, Yoi. These people were barely a warm-up for him, and not near enough to help him get his frustrations out. Just as Marco was about to take a step forward and end this quickly, he heard a small voice growl the king's name, so he turned and looked back to see the little creature Kuriha was taking care of. The look in the creature's eyes made Marco pause and look closer, taking in the pain and sadness that seemed to follow the poor little guy. Has this guy hurt you, Yoi? Marco asked softly, his voice tender not to scare away the creature. He killed my adoptive father. It responded, not really looking at Marco, but a new form of anger was stringing its way through Marco's heart. Is this a battle you want to pick, kid, Yoi? Marco asked him before taking a step backwards away from the king and his goons. I owe him this battle. He whispered, but Marco shook his head. You don't owe anyone a battle. He said, but tilted his head back to see his favorite teenager looking out the window, but much to Marco's surprise, he didn't have a smile on his face, but a slight frown. Marco was about to yell at Luffy to get back in bed, but the kid vanished as quickly as he had come. Having lived with Luffy for a good chunk of his life, he knew Luffy was up to something, but wouldn't interfere unless he had to. So you're interested in this kid, are you, Lu? He looked at the creature that had changed forms again, beginning a fight against the king and his whatever they were supposed to be. Kuriha had come out of the castle and stood beside Marco, her sharp eyes watching her student fight with all he had. I knew the man he called his father. He wasn't the greatest doctor, but he tried, and he loved that brat so much he asked me to pass on my skills to him. If it were anyone else asking me, I would have turned them away with a door in their faces," she said, crossing her arms, her eyes frozen on the boy as Marco watched as well. "We all do crazy things for our children, don't we, Yoi?" he asked her, Luffy in his mind, and what he'd do for him. "Their brat's planning on taking him from me, but can he heal the scars on Chopper's heart?" she asked, finally looking at Marco, who smiled a little before closing his eyes. "Garp's son has run away apparently and become a revolutionary of some sort," Thatch said, reading the paper, looking up at Marco, who was leaning on his arm looking out across the water. "So what, he's not our problem, Yoi." It was a beautiful day out, which meant nothing good in his opinion. "Stop being so down, it's not like you," Thatch said, elbowing him in the ribs, causing him to wince at the sharp pain. "I'm not down, I just don't see any real reason to care about Garp or his revolutionary son," he said, leaving Thatch standing there very confused. "Who pissed in your cereal this morning?" he asked under his breath, only to earn a glare and a scowl in return. "What do you mean Dragon wants to meet with you?" Thatch asked in surprise as Pops told them all of the meeting that would be taking place. "He has a request to make of me, but I know nothing else," Pop said to them as Marco frowned, not liking the idea of Dragon getting too close to their ship, to his home. "Whatever he wants doesn't matter. He's not a pirate or a marine, so we don't have to listen to him either way, Yoi," Marco said as Thatch frowned, Marco jumping down from the arm of Pop's chair and walking away with a wave. "He's pushing us away," Thatch thought out loud, worry in his voice. "Their brother is going through something important, be patient," Pop said knowingly to Thatch, who looked up at his father before giving his lopsided smile. "If you say so, I just hope he goes through it quick. I'm getting tired of this version of Marco. Why won't you stop crying? I've changed your diaper, I've fed you, what else do you want from me, Yoi?" Marco yelled at the screaming baby, tears brimming in his eyes at the frustration he was feeling. "Marco, what's wrong?" Thatch had knocked on the door, but with Marco panicking like this, he had missed it altogether. "Make him stop," he yelled as Thatch looked between the crying baby and the red-faced Marco before shaking his head. "You've checked everything?" Thatch asked, looking Luffy over as Marco nodded, his anger still there, but the cool ocean breeze that came through the open door was calming him and the kid down. "Have you tried, picking him up?" Thatch asked, looking at Marco, who looked confused. "Try carrying him around a bit, kids like to be held, you can't push him to the side like that," Thatch said, sternly picking Luffy up and passing him to Marco, who didn't really want to hold the screaming banshee brat. Since Thatch wasn't taking no for an answer, he reluctantly took the baby into his arms and looked down at it. Brown eyes with tears still at the edges looked at him, ready to explode again if he put the boy down. "Do that every once in a while and the kid shouldn't scream as much. You know though that if you can't handle this, Aizu has offered to take care of Luffy for you. We all know how busy you are and a baby just might be too much for you right now," he said as Marco continued to look at the brow eyes that were staring deeply into his own. No, I think I have this, I think it might be okay," he said slowly as it was Thatch's turn to look confused. "If that's everything then I'll just," Thatch began to say, but Marco turned and looked at him. "Thatch, thanks, Yoi," he said, and Thatch smiled softly at Marco before shaking his head at the man. "What are brothers for?" he asked, closing the door on the two. "I'm sorry I yelled at you, Luffy, can we compromise? I'll try and take better care of you if you let me sleep at night, Yoi," he said as the baby finally let out a laugh, making something in Marco's heart come back to life. After living for such a long time, Marco had started to feel his heart close off little by little. The baby smiled and not once cried through that night, for Marco keeping his promise. "Ma." Opening his eyes, Marco smiled slightly, looking towards the creature who had taken a hit from the king's men. "I think if anyone can heal a broken heart it will be Luffy, Yoi," he said with confidence, making Kuriha raise a brow at him, her eyes turning towards him now, taking in the smile on his face. "You speak from experience," she stated as he smiled a little bit more. "He saved me from my loneliness. I'd do anything and everything for Pops and my other many siblings, but for Luffy I'd give everything, Yoi," he said as a thin blur passed by him, pouting slightly. "Like I'd ask you to do something as stupid as that," Luffy said while pulling on a jacket, making Kuriha laugh. "Boy reindeer guy, I'm going to help you beat this guy up," Luffy said as the creature nodded, grateful for Luffy's help. "You think you can defeat me? I am the king of this island," he yelled at Luffy, who stepped past all of the king's attacks easily. "And to think my ma was going to waste his time fighting you, he'd have more fun fighting a tree and it would probably put up more of a fight," Luffy said as Chopper stepped back, amazed at Luffy's ease fighting the old king. "Why are you getting involved with this country brat? You're not even from here. Why do these people mean so much to you?" the king asked Luffy, but Luffy looked back at the reindeer. "These people help not just me, but my nakama, which makes them my friends," he said easily, still dodging the goons while the king jumped off his hippo. I'm going to show you something you'll never forget, kid. He said before opening his mouth wide and eating his two friends. Boy. You're not supposed to eat Nakama. Luffy said in panic and surprise, even Chopper and Marco looked mildly disturbed at this. Boy Luffy, are you having trouble fighting him? Luffy turned his head back to see Zoro leaning out of a window, his blades over his shoulder, and his brow rose. Stupid, like I'd have trouble here. He sounded insulted that Zoro would even ask such a stupid question. Like Luffy would have any trouble fighting that clown moss head, shame on you for doubting him. Sanji was sitting in another window smoking his cigarette and smirking as Zoro closed his eyes in annoyance. Don't make me kill you, shit cook. Zoro whispered, but Sanji heard it, his swirly brow twitching. Bring it on any day, shitty moss head. Sanji growled, which only made Marco fight off laughter at how well these people would fit in their huge family. Wow, look how strong Tony is. Vivi said happily, Nami beside her wrapped in a blanket keeping her warm as she nodded, glad to see the reindeer kid fighting for his home. I've got your back, Luffy, so go kick his ass. Usopp said, his slingshot in his hands as Luffy smiled, waiting to see what the king guy was going to do. Looking away from Usopp and his friends, Luffy saw the two guys the king had eaten were now free. Ah, you're back. He shouted, pointing at them as they laughed. You'll never win against us now, Straw Hat. They said, but Luffy tilted his head in confusion. Aren't you just riding on his shoulders? Luffy asked the two who just growled at Luffy as the king's eyes turned up toward something that was waving on the castle. That flag, how dare you place it on my castle? He shouted as Luffy turned to look and see what the big problem was. I'll fix that easily. He then turned his arm into a gun and aimed at the flag, Luffy's eyes widening along with Chopper's. Ma. Luffy shouted, not even pointing to what he wanted. Right. Marco turned into a phoenix and flew up to the castle, protecting the flag from destruction, blocking the cannon with a blue flamed wing, not even gaining a scratch from the attack. Marco smiled down, holding the flag proudly on the castle, nodding at Luffy, who returned the nod before looking at the king's anger in his eyes. How dare you, you're not a real pirate, are you? He asked as the king laughed. Pirate me? Of course not. I'm a king. He yelled in Luffy's face, but the boy wasn't smiling anymore. Marco was watching Luffy from above and even he could feel the air change around him. Boy reindeer guy, can you handle that guy? He asked, pointing to the freak as Chopper nodded, leaving the king to Luffy. Do you know the meaning behind a flag? He asked the king calmly. Meaning? What meaning? Flags have no meaning, boy. Chopper had begun his fight with the pair as Luffy continued his conversation. That's what makes you an idiot. A flag is something to be respected, not tarnished by fakes like you. He yelled at the king, who just made a face. Marco grinned from above, pushing the stick the flag was on back into place so it wouldn't fall before flying down from the castle. Are you going to do this or should I, Yoi? Marco asked as Luffy took a step forward only to get kicked in the side by the old witch doctor. I let you go for a moment there, kid, but may I ask just who gave you permission to get out of bed? She asked, lifting her glasses and glaring down at the rubber boy who was now on the ground holding his stomach in pain. That was hockey, no fair. He said, wincing, but it felt different. He knew he was hit by armament, but there was no sign of it being that form of hockey. Let your older brother take care of this one, kid, you really worried him. She said to Luffy quietly, who opened his mouth, but no words came out before turning his head down, admitting defeat. I'll make this quick. Oi reindeer kid, you doing alright over there, Yoi? Marco called out to Chopper, who nodded, finishing his battle up with a few injuries. Why? Why are you helping this brat? This country? I am its king. I am the ruler here. How dare you attack me? He yelled, jumping off the hippo and disappearing into the snow. Watch out. He can camouflage into the snow. Chopper yelled at Marco, who nodded, letting his observation hockey do all the work for him. Closing his eyes, Marco let his senses sift through the snow and find the king, who was moving carefully, trying to find the best place to attack Marco. I'm helping because honestly, I don't like you, Yoi. Marco said, causing the man to growl in anger as Marco listened and watched through the snow. Don't watch how your brother moves, brat, watch everything else. Kuriha whispered to Luffy, who looked confused at her words. What do you mean everything else? He asked as she smiled. You can use hockey, I'm guessing, so here's a tip from a nice young lady. Let your observation take in the surrounding area, but if you can, let your king's hockey see through the enemy's soul. She said as Luffy frowned. See through their soul? Try it. She pointed to the battles as Marco stood still, letting the snow blow around his bare ankles and up his legs. Letting his observation hockey strengthen, Luffy began to see through the snow faster and things began to get clearer. You can see through the snow by now, judging by that look you've got. Try and use observation hockey, but not use your king's hockey. She suggested, but he began to get frustrated. What the heck does that mean? He said through gritted teeth. There's no other way to explain it, you can either do this or not. She said to him. Taking a deep breath, Luffy tried to think of his haki and how to control it enough to use as a weapon, but not enough to harm the people around him. "You're putting too much thought into it, relax," she advised as he took another deep breath. Opening his eyes, he could now see the king, who was making his move to attack Marco. Letting out the breath, everything seemed to slow down. The king moved and blurred into a color of gray as Marco stepped slowly into a color of blue. The two clashed and the gray faded instantly. What was that?" he breathed out as she laughed. "Your first taste into what I have named the Empress's haki. With the combination of two hakis you can enhance your senses to the maximum they can go." She started, but he gave her a look. "How did you know I could use the king's haki?" he asked as she smiled. "Because they could use it and you're very much like them," she said knowingly. "The combination of two haki, why not use all three?" he asked, but she frowned. "It would be too much and not worth your life. I suggest you master them all separately before you try combining them anymore. You're strong, but you will need to be stronger to survive here." Luffy looked away, his mind racing at what he had just done. "Man, I feel much better, Yoi," Marco said, stretching and looking down at Luffy before frowning. "What's wrong?" he asked before dropping into a kneeling position to check on the boy. "Nothing, I just need to get stronger," he said as Marco patted the teenager's head. "You'll have plenty of time to do that, Yoi," Marco said as Luffy's nakama came out of the castle. Usopp looking off into the distance. "Wow, you really sent them flying. You think they'll ever come back?" he asked Marco, who chuckled, but Luffy shook his head. "He won't unless he's looking for a real fight," Luffy said as Marco looked at him, a brow raised. "And what's that supposed to mean, Yoi?" he asked as Luffy smirked. "Just that I would have beaten him a long time ago if he was fighting against me," Luffy said as Marco lifted Luffy's hat off his head and dug his fist into the boy's hair. "Says the boy who can't even escape one of my simple attacks, Yoi." Luffy freaked out, trying to pull Marco's fist out of his hair. "Alright, I give," he cried out as those around them started to laugh. "You look like you're feeling better, Luffy," Nami said, walking up beside him and smiling, reaching her hand down to help him stand up. "You as well." He grinned before turning towards the reindeer that was a little beaten up. "I think I have you to thank, don't I?" Luffy asked, walking towards him, but the little guy was watching Luffy. "Why did you help us? You didn't need to, but you did, why?" he asked Luffy, who frowned at the guy. "We're friends, right, and friends help each other out when they need it," he said simply as Chopper's eyes widened and teared up a bit. "You too. Back in bed, you still need a week before I'm letting you both out of my sight," she yelled, but Luffy shook his head. "I'm alright, reindeer guy Chopper, join my crew," he said as Chopper's eyes widened and his mouth opened to respond before Luffy got a kick in the back, knocking into a pile of snow. "Did you just ignore me? My words weren't a request, boy, they were an order." "Back in bed," she yelled, picking Luffy up by the ear and dragging him back into the castle as Marco watched, shaking his head at the scene. "He's a little energetic, but the kid's got the biggest heart you'll ever find. Take his request seriously, Yoi," Marco said to the little guy who was staring off in the distance, memories flashing behind his eyes as Marco walked away, giving him space to think. A few days later and the small crew was up and ready to go. "I'm so bored. I want to start my adventure right now," Luffy shouted, running around as a few people sighed. "We're going, Luffy, no need to shout at us," Nami said quietly, but even she was ready to keep moving. "He's even more hyped up." Vivi laughed to herself as Nami sighed in exasperation. "If you think this is hype, just wait until we get back on the Mary," she said, giving a small smile. "Oi ma, where's your ship?" Luffy asked, thinking back on why he was here. "Ace has it, he's headed towards Alabasta now, so we should follow behind him, Yoi," Marco said, throwing a sack over his shoulder of things to bring to the ship. "Oh, so how are you getting there?" Luffy asked as Marco gave a small smile. "Why, I'll be hanging with you and your crew for a little while, of course, Yoi," he said, walking past a stunned Luffy. "I don't want my mother babysitting me in front of my crew," Luffy yelled at his back as Marco chuckled. "Then stand up and be a captain and I won't have to," he joked as Luffy closed his eyes in annoyance, following Marco out of the castle alongside his crew before stopping. "Luffy? Boy Chopper?" he yelled as the reindeer guy came out of the shadows and looked at Luffy, his eyes firm but teary. "I came to say goodbye. As much as I'd love to go with you, I can't. You're a human and I'm a monster, so we just wouldn't work well together. There's no way we could ever be true friends. Saying that, if you ever come back here I don't mind," he said, but stopped as Luffy held out his hand, silencing him. "Shut up and let's go, we're all a bunch of monsters on this crew," he said before giving his toothy grin. Chopper looked back at Kariha, who nodded, tears in her eyes, but well hidden away. "At going, my idiot son." Marco could have sworn he heard through the winter wind, so he chuckled in response. "And you told me not to get close to mortal people, Yoi," He turned and walked away as Chopper took Luffy's outstretched hand, accepting when suddenly a loud bang went off and the whole night sky was tainted pink. "The smell," Chopper said as his eyes widened as a familiar smell hit his sensitive nose. "Let's go already," Luffy yelled as they all made their way down the bridge to their ship as Chopper was both smiling and crying. Doctorine, I'm going to do it. I'll become the greatest doctor ever just like you both," he yelled as the whole crew smiled. A new dream had been added to theirs, a new brother for Marco and a new friend for Straw Hats. "You'll be better, I know it. You promised me, Yoi." "Did I?" "You did, meaning you're breaking your word." Marco crossed his arms as Luffy sat on the lamb figurehead pouting. "I don't remember making any promises, so I'm not actually breaking anything," he said looking at Marco, who was beginning to fume. "One more week of rest, you promised me one more week resting," he said as Luffy brought his fist to his chin looking like he was going to think about those words but decided not to. "Sanji. I'm hungry," he said ignoring Marco for what felt like the millionth time as he rocketed away towards the kitchen. "I'd give it up if I were you," Zoro said looking up from where he was napping. "He's my little brother, making it's my job to worry about him, Yoi." Marco looked at the relaxed way the first mate was acting and raised a brow at him further up his face. "That's no longer really your job, Commander, so relax," Zoro said easily closing his eyes again as Marco frowned. Zoro has a bad way of wording things, but he is right. Luffy is ours to worry about now, so stop giving me that expression. Nami smiled from the upper part of the deck down to Marco, who sighed. "He'll always be mine to worry about, Yoi," he said but returned the smile. "You'll go grey thinking like that," she said before excusing herself with a small laugh. "Boy Luffy. There's an island up ahead," Usopp called out loudly, making the rubber boy appear almost out of nowhere with a chunk of meat in his hands and a smile on his face. "Is it Alabasta?" he asked in excitement, but Vivi looked far ahead and shook her head. "Not quite, that looks like a neighboring island though. I believe we get fresh fruits, vegetables, and other foods my island can't grow due to the heat from this island," she said softly as Luffy began to bounce on his feet a little. "We should keep going, we need to get to Alabasta as soon as possible," Nami called from her doorway, reading Luffy like a book from that distance as he turned his neck all the way around and gave her a sad look. "Don't you dare, Luffy," she snapped, but he didn't even flinch at her tone, instead he grinned his famous grin and shouted for all to hear. "We're making a quick stop at that island up ahead," he yelled as Nami called after him in annoyance. "Don't worry too much, Nami, it should only be a quick stop, we're not too far from my home country and Luffy could really use some time on land," she said as Nami puffed her cheek out. "We'll take this moment to stock up on supplies, but we're only staying the day," she said as Chopper came up beside her as well, shyly getting her attention. "The infirmary really needs stocking up on as well. I found basic first aid equipment, but I'd like to make sure it's properly able to be used," he said as Nami sighed and gave the boy a smile. "I'll help you find everything you need, Tony," Vivi said to him as they went to start writing out a list of things needed to buy. Nami looked down at her laughing captain, who was joking with Usopp and singing about the next island before closing her door and sighing. This was her crew and family whether she liked it or not. "Here, you look like you need it." Zoro, who was napping only moment before, was now on his feet passing Marco a bottle of hard liquor as the lazy eyes looked down at the brand name carefully. "You don't look like the kind of man who would share his drink, Yoi," he said accepting the token as the first mate smirked in agreement. "I'm not, but it seems like you've been away from my captain for too long," he said as Marco turned his eyes up looking at the swordsman confused. "Drink up first, Commander, if you're staying here, you're going to need it." He walked past Marco to find a new sleeping spot that was closer to Luffy in case of any need to protect him or drown him, depending on the moment of time and situation. As soon as they docked, the merry Luffy bolted from the ship onto dry land, a large grin on his face. "Someone follow him, not you, Zoro. I don't have all week to spend hunting you both down," Nami ordered as Zoro scowled and growled at Nami for those words. "I'll find him, I know exactly where he's going, Yoi," Marco said as Zoro sat back down on the deck. "I'll keep watch over the ship, bring him back safe," he said looking at Marco, hard silver meeting frozen blue. "I intend to, Yoi." Nami sighed, glad to have Marco on the ship helping out. "We're off now," Vivi said as she and Chopper walked off the ship, a list in her hand of the items needed to buy. "I've got work to do before we get to Alabasta," Usopp said, waving at the others before moving to his makeshift weapons lab. "Don't overspend, you guys," she called before closing her door to finish her own work. Marco was right when he said he knew where Luffy was. The boy was sitting on a bar stool ordering the entire menu from a small restaurant. "You really going to eat all that, boy?" the owner asked looking at the scrawny figure Luffy had, but the boy laughed loudly and nodded his head quickly. "I'd double the order if you want him to be satisfied, really, Yoi," Marco said, taking a seat beside Luffy and stealing some of the fries that had been brought to Luffy. Hey, get your own. He scowled as Marco stole another, not realizing just how hungry he had gotten as he called the waiter over to order some off his own. Where do you want to go on this island, Lou? He asked as Luffy continued to eat. I know yet, but I thought I'd check it out for now. He said through a mouthful of food, making Marco frown at him. You, swallow then talk, Luffy, manners, we talked about this before, yoi. He scolded as Luffy fought not to roll his eyes. I'm not a kid, Marco, I can handle myself now. Then prove it as a captain, your crew's lives are all in your hands now, yoi. Marco said to Luffy, seriously stealing yet another fry, much to Luffy's annoyance. I'd give my life for them. He replied, smacking Marco's hand away from his plate and giving the blonde one of his rare serious looks. That's what makes you a good leader, Lou, but it's also their job to protect you, yoi. He said as a plate of food was placed in front of him. As long as they're safe, I don't really care about me. I made a promise to Vivi and I will keep it, but I think we should have done something before. He said, dropping his fork down on his now empty plate. Your crew wouldn't like it hearing you talk like that. Marco said because he didn't like hearing Luffy talk like that. We couldn't have done anything before. Pops is an emperor, if he had stepped in, it would have caused more damage than good for that girl's country. He said as Luffy frowned, not really understanding but trying really hard to. You're here to help her now, so relax a little, alright? He said, making Luffy sigh, then return the smile. X. Zoro had one eye open as he laid on the deck, his swords beside him carefully. Something felt off and he secretly wondered if Luffy felt it as well. Standing up and looking around the ship, he frowned a bit more since there didn't seem to be anyone nearby, but the feeling he had told him not to trust his eyes. Sorry, Captain, but I might take a walk. He said, jumping off the ship, his boots hitting the dirt, his hearing sharper than ever as he closed his eyes. I think I'll go that way, he said as a soft laugh caught his attention. WhiteBeard, pirate and Straw Hat Luffy. Definitely going that way. He said, touching his blade, letting it calm his nerves because he knew how Luffy hated being tied to the name of WhiteBeard's youngest. Let's deal with this before it becomes my captain's problem. Nami was returning to the ship, bags in her hands of clothes and important papers for her to chart her maps properly when she saw Zoro walking away from the ship in a random direction. I knew he couldn't stay still, he and Luffy are cut from the same cloth after all. She growled as she ran towards the Mary, dropped her belongings off in her room before chasing after him, prepared to drag his lost ass home. Zoro. She almost growled, but he turned on his heels and shushed her quickly with a cold glare. Someone here recognizes Luffy. He said sharply, making her close her mouth, her brows knitting together. It's not like people won't now that he has a bounty. She said to him, but he had turned his eyes back towards the trees, trying to find something she didn't see. They don't recognize him because of that, Nami, they're looking to pick a fight with the old man. He said softly, but Nami still frowned. Let them try, we have Marco here so we can relax. She said, but closed her mouth with Zoro's firm stare. We are not underlings, we are not people in a division separated from another crew. I follow Luffy, not Marco, not WhiteBeard, not anyone. She should have known Zoro, the most loyal of the crew, would be protective of Luffy in this way. I never said we were following Marco or the old man, just that. She tried to find the right words, but Zoro brushed her off, moving forward looking for the opponents he needed to fight so he could return to his nap. Well, I can't just let you do this all on your own now, can I? She asked, pulling her new weapon out of its holder on her hip. Just don't get in my way. He said, pushing some branches out of his face and stepping more into the trees. I'll say the same to you. X. I heard Straw Hat Luffy's crew is sneaking around the forest. Luffy's ears twitched as he walked past a few gossiping villagers while Marco was paying for a few things. Nama, why don't we go check on the ship? He said casually, his eyes looking around the village, not seeing his crewmates anywhere. You're finished exploring already? Marco asked as Luffy frowned slightly. Man, just for now, we can't stay here long anyway, you heard Nami, we need to be back en route for Vivi. He said, passing Marco and walking in what might have been the direction of the ship, but Marco grabbed his elbow, stopping him. Luffy took a chance and looked at Marco, who wasn't smiling as he searched Luffy's eyes, but then relaxed, giving in to the boy. The ship's in this direction, yoi. Luffy's body visibly relaxed as Marco noticed, but the boy accepted Marco's direction to the ship. I didn't know you cared about getting back on track so quickly, yoi. Marco said to Luffy, who chuckled. I don't. I just know better than to ignore Nami when she wants something. He smiled as Marco hummed, his eyes looking down at the boy carefully. Is that so? Marco's heart tightened slightly at the idea his little brother might be stolen away from him. What's with that look, are you feeling okay, ma? He asked Marco in worry, but the blonde shook his head and laughed. Don't grow up too quick, brat. He said, but Luffy chose to ignore him as Usopp was jumping off the ship and running towards Luffy. Vivi and Chopper just got back, but Nami and Zoro are still on the island. He said as Luffy closed his eyes, searching for them. I heard some people say we were sneaking in the forest, so that's probably where they are. he said, giving his big grin and pointing to the trees. What the heck are they doing there? Usopp sighed, chopped, looking at the forest and sniffing the air. I smell other people that way, he said to Luffy, who nodded. I figured, let's go get them. He began to walk towards the forest when a hand grabbed his shirt, tugging him backwards. I'll go get them, it'll be faster if you all stay here, yoi. Marco said as everyone stopped moving for a moment, looking at Luffy. Sorry, no can do, Mr. Commander. Sanji walked towards them. Vivi walked off the ship to stand by Chopper and Usopp as Marco raised a brow further. We follow Luffy's orders, not yours, he said, sternly, flicking ash off of his smoke, his one eye catching Marco's. The gold in that one eye shone brightly, the flame of loyalty causing Marco to not fight, the grin forming on his face. Then I suggest we find them quickly, he said as Vivi and Chopper stepped back, choosing to watch over the ship, leaving Usopp, Sanji, Luffy and Marco to bring the missing two back safely. X. Halalala, and what do we have here? Zoro felt his skin crawl at the look from this creeper wearing a black mask and clip-on cat ears in his orange hair. Nope, Nami said, crossing her arms and giving Zoro a deadpan look, not wanting to fight this creep. What does that mean, witch? Zoro asked. He put his blade away. It means nope, I'm not putting up with this shit, not now, not ever. This guy didn't look strong, but the way his eyes traveled up and down her body made her cringe. So you're going to make me do all the work as usual? He asked as she scowled. If you both are done, I'm afraid I must kill you now, he said with a sad sort of whine in his voice. Kill us really? Zoro said, not really thinking this guy could even beat a marine grunt. Well, not exactly kill you, see, but rather I need to use you both. Zoro frowned, not really understanding, and by the frown on Nami's face, she didn't really understand this freak either. Use us? But didn't you just say you wanted to kill us? What an idiot. Nami scoffed, pulling out her new weapon Usopp had made for her. Oh, don't doubt my words, little lady, I do plan on killing you both, but first you'll make a wonderful trap for your captain and his white-beard friend. The creep said through a slimy grin, standing up and blowing them a sick kiss. Zoro pulled his blade out from its sheath. Like I'll ever be used as a trap, I hope you've prepared yourself. Oh, there will be no need, my little slaves, now welcome to my paradise. X. When Luffy and the others showed up, they froze in their tracks at the scene that was happening in front of them. Was all Luffy could mutter as Nami and Zoro were all cuddled up, flirting silently with one another. What the hell? Sanji had turned into a blonde smoking torch, his anger so fierce flames began to burn around him. Welcome, cuties. Luffy had to hold back the urge to step back away from the voice. Luffy, it's about time you got here. Nami cooed from the ground, her face a tint of red and pink, but her eyes were glazed over as if she wasn't actually seeing. Come join us, Captain. Zoro stood up as well and offered out his hand, much like Nami, his eyes were glazed and unfocused. Sanji was about to take the offer and end Zoro's life by fire, but Marco stood in his path, blocking him. Let me at him. Sanji growled, but Marco sighed, pushing the cook backwards. Cool it, Romeo, something's not right, Marco said, looking at Luffy, who was watching his two best friends make faces at one another in annoyance. What did you do to them? Luffy's voice came out cold and sharp, surprising Marco and the few around him. Nothing much, dearie, I just showed them their true passion, halalala. The orange-haired cat freak laughed, but Luffy wasn't smiling. Fix them. Now, he said, but his voice didn't even rise to a shout, but more of a commanding tone. And what makes you think they're broken? You foolish boy. I am the proud possessor of the passion fruit, he said, and if Luffy's friends hadn't been making more weird faces at one another, Luffy might have laughed at the stupidity of the fruit name. You mean like that fruit you can buy at markets? Usopp asked as the creep rolled his eyes and blew Usopp a kiss, making the teenager throw his hands in front of himself, trying to protect himself. Luffy turned on his heels quick and looked at Usopp, trying to see if he was alright as the boy lowered his arms. What's with that look, Luffy? You should smile more. Frowning will give you wrinkles, Usopp said before winking in his direction, making Luffy shiver and this time actually take a step back. You see, boy, all it takes is one of my kisses and you belong to me. So his kisses are his attack, yoi. Marco observed and shook his head at how stupid the attack actually was. Let my friends go, Luffy ordered, ignoring Marco as the creep jumped down from his rock and smirked at Luffy. You see, boy, you've earned yourself a reputation as well as being friends with the WhiteBeard crew. I have decided you all will make a perfect collector's item on my crew. The creepy man winked at Luffy, who didn't even make an expression at him. That's the reason you are hurting my crew? Luffy asked, his eyes flashing dangerously. I never said I was hurting them, am I hurting you, sweethearts? He asked them as Usopp picked a flower, placing it behind Nami's ear softly. Of course not, master, she said kindly, batting her lashes, making Luffy want to throw up. Instead he took a step forward. With you under my control, I can convince old man WhiteBeard to do anything for the sake of his precious little swans. he said as Luffy's hand gripped into a fist in frustration. Standing still, Marco crossed his arms and watched Luffy, wondering what the boy was going to do. He knew Luffy's observation haki was strong, so he didn't worry about him getting hit by those pathetic attacks. Of course, that was until Luffy stepped right into one of the kisses blown his way. "And look at that, I now have a captain for my slave," he said as Marco growled under his breath, hard eyes staring at Luffy's back since the boy had stopped walking. The man walked up to Luffy with a bounce in his step, expecting to find a sweet pacified boy. Instead, he was greeted to cold hard eyes. "Give them back," Luffy growled out before bringing up his fist and decking the man right under the chin, sending him flying up into the air. The man landed with a loud thunk on the dirt, a few of his crewmates running around in a panic. "What, how did you?" he screeched out, his hand on his chin, tears in his eyes. "Like I'd fall for shit like that. Did you hear that, Zoro? Wake up already, damn it," he shouted at his first mate, whose glossy eyes were beginning to come back into focus. The expression on Zoro's face started out in confusion but swiftly formed into rage Luffy had never seen before. "I feel like shit," he said as Luffy nodded in his direction. "You look like it too. Care to tell me how both you and Nami got trapped by this weirdo?" he asked, raising a brow, but the look of disappointment was very visible on Luffy's face. "I let my guard down and got cocky, it won't happen again," he said, turning towards the weirdo who was starting to pick himself up from the dirt. No one has ever broken away from me," he yelled, but Luffy gritted his teeth, ready to go in and finish this guy off once and for all. "No, let me handle this one," Zoro said, his eyes taking on a dangerous glint. "I hope you don't mind me helping you out." Nami was standing up, her hand over her eyes as she took a few deep breaths, trying to calm her anger, but failing. Zoro turned to look at the creep who was cowering now under Zoro's piercing glare as the rage turned into a sadistic smile. "Have you ever learned what happens to those who piss of a dragon?" he asked, taking a step forward as Nami pressed a few switches on her rod, a few red and blue orbs hovering now over the creep's head. I didn't think," he started as Luffy stepped back to be in place with Marco, who still stood in front of Sanji blocking his path, but the blonde just watched in angry silence, smoking his third cigarette. "They don't live to tell the tale," Nami said, bringing her rod down, electricity hitting the creep, and Zoro, using only one blade, sliced him down the front, making him fall backwards in pain, blacking out. "I am sorry," he muttered, his eyes rolled back in his skull. "Here's a new lesson for you to remember, don't ever touch the Straw Hat crew again," Zoro said, looking down at the man with cold eyes before turning to look at Luffy, who was already walking away, an air of cheer surrounding him, but Zoro knew better. "I'm glad that's over with, I'm starving now. Sanji, I want food quickly when we get back," he yelled as Nami caught up to them, ripping the flower out of her hair, annoyed that this even happened. Turning her eyes, she observed Zoro before crossing her arms and scoffing. "If I ever make faces like that towards you again, please put me out of my misery," she said to him as he smirked. "Gladly. There are some pretty strange powers here on the Grand Line," Usopp muttered to himself, thinking of creating some sort of memory wipe to erase this day from his mind. "And this is only the first half," Marco said kindly, making Usopp shiver. When they reached the Mary again, Vivi and Chopper greeted them with questions, but the pair looked at one another and shook their heads. Nothing happened. They both said at the same time before separating to different parts of the deck. "So something did happen?" Vivi asked Luffy, who laughed. "Maybe, dunno actually. Man, I'm hungry," he whined, making his way to the galley for his afternoon snack. Humming Luffy. Sanji sighed, deciding to let today's actions go, but should that moss head ever step out of line like that again, he will fillet him himself. Later that evening, Marco found Luffy on top of the lamb figurehead, the rest of the crew scattered off doing their nightly chores. Nami was writing today's events in the log even if she didn't want to, it was a task that needed to be done. Usopp was cleaning up his weapon lab area, putting his tools back in their proper spots. Chopper and Vivi were organizing the infirmary to match his expectations, Sanji wiping and sanitizing the kitchen for the morning's use, and Zoro training with heavy weights close by. Marco was about to open his mouth and call out to Luffy, but Zoro dropped his weapon on the deck and moved faster. "Luffy?" Zoro called out, making Marco take a step back, letting the boys have their moment together. "The day sucked," he said, simply letting the sea waves crash on the ship's side as the sun beginning to set over the horizon. "No, it didn't." Zoro climbed up the figurehead and sat down beside him, forcing Luffy to move over and share his special spot. "I almost lost you guys," he said, barely over a whisper. "No, you didn't. It will take a lot more than that freaky-looking guy to take us away from you, Luffy." Zoro laughed softly at the stupidity of the thought. "But what if someone does, then what?" Luffy's eyes were cast on the water, the orange and blue reflecting in his brown. "I don't like to think that way, Luffy. We're pirates living on these seas, following no laws or orders other than our own. People are going to come after us the further we go into the Grand Line. We have a few choices on this though. One, we could all return to your father's ship, have him protect us for the rest of our lives living comfortably, but even then we'd still face enemies. Luffy gave Zoro a distasteful look at the idea of going home and sailing under his pops. Two, we can continue on like we always have and protect one another's backs from the people who want to get at us. Luffy, as much as you hate it, people are going to come after you for your father's name. You can sit and grumble each and every time or make them remember your name when you beat them down. I follow you, Luffy. What happened today was a mistake and one that could have gone wrong, and for that I am sorry. I promise you, Luffy, that I will become stronger. If you're going to become the king of the pirates, I need to be worthy to stand by your side, and today I was not. Zoro closed his eyes, but Luffy sighed and pulled his friend close, bumping shoulders. We all suck today, not just you. I need to train harder as well after all. I need to be worthy enough to someday stand by your side when you become the greatest swordsman in the world. He said, making Zoro snap his eyes open and a small smile to form on his face as Luffy began to laugh. Shishishi, though it was pretty funny watching you make kissy faces towards Nami, shishishi. He giggled again before ducking, avoiding Zoro's fist. Oh, would you rather have been the one making faces? Zoro asked, making Luffy shut his mouth before aiming a punch at Zoro, who blocked it with a smirk. Why would I want to do that? He asked, sounding genuinely confused as Zoro aimed a kick to Luffy's head, the boy dodging it with a string of laughter. Marco watched from the sidelines out of sight from the boys, but smiled at their play training session. You've made some really good friends, Kid Yoi. Marco turned and walked away, leaving them alone to have their fun. Luffy was lying at his pop's feet, panting heavily and dripping in sweat. The heat formed the summer island too much for his rubbery body. Pops, can't we go to a winter island already? He whined, the heat from the summer island making his body ache. You complained only a few weeks ago about the cold, Luffy. He reminded the boy, who groaned and tried to roll himself over to look up at his father. Cold and hot are annoying. He said with the little energy he had. I know what you're complaining about, Lou. I perfectly love this weather. Ace was leaning over the railing and looking out at the sea, enjoying the wind that came across the waves. You would, Mr. Flame for brains. Luffy scowled along with Ace. You're cranky when you're hot. Ace got an idea as Luffy rolled onto his back and let his tongue roll out of his mouth. Running to an area where he could pull up some seawater, Ace let his bucket fill and carefully brought it back to the deck. This should help some. Ace smirked as Luffy was too hot to look up at his scheming brother until the bucket of cold water was dumped onto said boy. Sitting up quickly, Luffy glared from under his bangs up at Ace, who was smiling like a little devil. Feel better, Lou? He asked through that smile as Luffy closed his eyes and let his face fall blank before looking up at Ace with an eerily calm look and a big smile. Oh yeah, that was great. He said, but ignoring the tone of voice, Ace could see a glint in the teenager's eyes. It was so great that I just have to share it with you. He stood up, but Ace was already running, laughter filling the ship. Come and get me. Ace called over his shoulder as Luffy ran after him, but stopped, giving Ace a chance to get further away. I can't do this on my own, it's way too hot out here. He looked up at the burning sun that wasn't planning on setting anytime soon. I need some help. Running in the opposite direction, Luffy knocked on a few doors, but one in particular opened to a grinning man. I smell something fun going on. Thatch said, leaning on his doorframe. Ace dumped water on me, I want revenge. Care to help a brother out? Luffy asked Thatch, whose smile couldn't have gotten any bigger. I have just the thing, little brother. Ace, on the other hand, knew Luffy would go to the pranking king himself, so he had to think quick if he was going to escape Luffy's evil plans. Marco. Ace almost collided with the commander's door, but Marco could hear him coming and opened the door before sitting back down at his desk to finish what work he had left. What did you do this time, Yoi? I just dumped a bucket of water on Luffy, who's now looking for revenge and probably joining up with Thatch. I can't beat them both on my own, and we all know you're Luffy's weakness. Luffy's weakness, really, Yoi? He said in a tone that made Ace look away with a pout. Tell you what, I'll help you out. Marco said, putting his pencil down on the desk, leaving his work alone for the time being. Really? Ace asked, looking at Marco, who was now moving towards his bookshelf and moving a few things around. I have just the plan to make Thatch regret pranking my division last week, Yoi. The evil glint in the commander's eyes made Ace wonder just what Thatch did to earn such a look from the normally calm and collected commander. Fill these up and we'll start our attack, Yoi. Ace caught what Marco was holding and grinned. They'll never see it coming. X. You really think this will work? Luffy asked Thatch, who had his division filling water guns and balloons up as they spoke. I think Ace won't see this coming, and I bet he roped Sabo into this as well, so we need to make sure we have lots to pull this attack off properly. Thatch had done pranks his whole life, but this was no prank, this was a water war. Once all was filled, the 4th Division brought all their weapons to the main deck, where Pops could watch the battle unfold. Ace. I call you out for war. Luffy screamed knowing his voice could reach Ace anywhere. No need to shout, Lu, I've been waiting for you. Ace arrived with Marco and a few others from the many divisions behind them. Ma. You're betraying me? Luffy asked, giving his ma the puppy dog look. Sorry Lu, but I need to have my own revenge, Yoi. His eyes meeting Thatch's gleaming ones. Are you calling me out, dear brother? Thatch asked, his smile turning feral. Of course, Yoi. Pop smiled at the groups that were formed knowing he was in for a treat. If any of my books get wet, I'll drown them all. Sabo had climbed up the old man's chair, careful of his medical equipment and watching the groups as well. You're not joining in, my son? Pops asked the blonde, who laughed. I prefer less wet ways of getting my revenge. He smiled at Pops, who laughed knowingly. The water fight went on for hours, the hot sun no longer a problem for the teenager as he grabbed one of the water guns someone had discarded and pointed it into Ace's face. Fire and water don't exactly match, Ace. Luffy smiled while shooting Ace right in his face. No, but you and this balloon should get along just fine. Ace threw the bulging water balloon right into Luffy's face, both of them soaking from the attacks before laughing with one another. You know what this calls for? Thatch asked, wiping water off his face with a smile. A good cold drink, Yoi. Marco responded, his regular shirt long thrown away from the mess. Nah, did any of you idiots put any sunscreen on? Sabo asked, drinking from a mug what appeared to be juice, or at least Marco hoped so. Sunscreen? Luffy asked as the blonde smiled. So by tomorrow we might be giving Akagami a run for his money. Sabo laughed to Pops, who shook his head but laughed along with his son. And why's that? Ace asked, his brow raised. Because. Sabo started jumping down and slapping his hand on Ace's shoulder, making the teenager jump and grab his arm in surprise. Hockey? He asked, looking at Sabo, who shook his head no. Nope, something much, much worse. He said, a shadow covering his eyes. The sunburn. With those words, Sabo walked away laughing as Ace looked up at the sky in annoyance. I'm fire, I didn't think I could get burned, he sighed and looked at each of the people who were partaking in their fight. Each of the members had a bit of red on places the sun could touch, even Luffy's cheeks had a rosy tint to them. Ace. Luffy stood beside his brother and watched Sabo go to the galley to refill his drink. You thinking what I'm thinking? Ace asked Luffy, who smirked. I still got about 4 balloons left. Luffy tossed one in the air and caught it again. I've got a few left over myself, why don't we show Sabo a little bit of fun? He asked Luffy, whose grin spread across his face. Let's do it. It's hot out there. Luffy whined, throwing his body over the table and letting his tongue roll out, emphasizing his annoyance before sucking it back up at Sanji's cold glare. People eat food off that table, Luffy. If so much as a single drop of your shitty drool hits my polished work of art, I'll cut you up and serve you for breakfast. He said calmly, but the glare shining Luffy's way made Luffy think twice before pissing off his chef, even if it would be fun to do. We're here. Vivi opened the door with a crash. Her face should have had a large smile on it because she was home, but instead her eyes clearly showed the sadness of seeing the place she loved so hurt. That's why it's so stupidly hot out there. Luffy complained once again but picked himself up and walked out into the heat regardless. Boy Luffy. I think someone's drowning over there. Usopp shouted down to them, his telescope in his hand, while his other pointed at the splashing swan. Zoro, feeling up for a swim? He asked his best friend, who was already taking his shirt off and sighing. Did I ever get the choice? He asked, hearing Luffy laugh before he jumped into the cold sea waves to rescue whatever strange person Luffy was bound to befriend next. Boy Luffy, who's that? Sanji pointed his foot towards the drowned man, who was wearing makeup and a frilly swan outfit. Sanji was curious about the stranger, but not curious enough to step any closer to the man than he had to. Dunno, but he looks interesting. Luffy laughed some more before dropping down beside the weird man and poking his stomach, letting a stream of water spout from his mouth. Shishishi. Interesting doesn't seem to be the right words, Yoi. The man sat up suddenly and looked around at everyone who was watching him cautiously, all but Luffy of course, who was grinning at his potential new friend. Where am I? The man asked, looking around at the people surrounding him. You were drowning, so I had Zoro here save your ass. Luffy said casually as the man turned his eyes on the straw-hatted captain. You saved me? He asked quietly before grinning. You are the kindest man I have ever met. He stood up and brushed his clothes off. So who are you? Luffy asked, getting up as the weird man struck a pose. My name is Bone Clay, may I ask yours? He was still smiling at Luffy, who laughed. I'm Luffy and these are my Nakama and my ma. The man looked around, his eyes looking at each individual member, but hesitated for a moment on Vivi and Marco, which didn't go unnoticed by the straw-hatted boy. Out of everyone here, I do believe you might be the cutest, quite the babe. He blew a kiss towards Vivi, but Sanji stepped in front of her, protecting the princess. You keep away from her, creep. Sanji said, blowing steam from his nose in a huff. You guys are funny, but what were you doing splashing in the water like that? Can't swim or something? He asked the man, a small look in his eyes at those words, making the weird man sigh, but returned his attention back to Luffy. That's right, I ate a devil fruit so I'm doomed to sink. He said dramatically. What kind of fruit did you eat? Luffy asked him excitedly, wondering if it will be as cool as his brothers back home or even as strong as his pops, but he doubted it. Marco knew people had fruit abilities this far from the new world, but unlike Luffy, he didn't get his hopes up for something cool. I guess as thanks for saving my life I can give you a taste of my abilities, also I have nowhere to go until my crew comes to get me, so why not? He asked as Luffy began to clap his hands in excitement. Sure, I want to see it. Luffy stood up as the man shot his hand at Luffy's face, but out of habit, he sidestepped it, looking confused as the man hit the wall suddenly. Would you try and hit me? Luffy asked, staring at him blankly as Zoro touched his blade, threateningly warning the man should he try and hit Luffy again it would end very badly. You were supposed to let me touch you. He shouted as Luffy looked confused, then smiled. Marco on the other hand glared harder at the weirdo. If that was the case all you had to do was ask. The man put his hand on Luffy's shoulder, but grumbled a bit at Luffy dodging him so easily. Try anything again and I'll slice you up. Zoro put his blade away, but his sharp eyes wouldn't leave the strange man ever again. Calm down there, Mr. Swordsman, I'm not doing any harm, it's all in a little fun, right? He asked, but to everyone's surprise, it was the face of Luffy on a strange man. What the? Zoro asked and Marco's eyes narrowed. All I need to do is touch you guys with this hand and I become you, in a sense. He said as Marco frowned, not liking that at all. And if I touch with my other hand I can turn back. He said and laughed before running up to people and trying to touch them all. Sanji stepped away from the man as quickly as possible, not wanting to be touched by a freak, while Marco glared so hard at him, he didn't even bother coming the commander's way. Turning around, the man had become Luffy again, much to Marco's annoyance. You see? Luffy's face said. I can become just about anyone. Usopp's face said. And practically everyone if I wanted to. Chopper's face said. It's as simple as that. Zoro's face said suddenly. And it comes with perks, if you know what I mean. Nami's face said with a smirk as the man brought his hands down to open his shirt, but Marco stepped in with a kick to the man's face before Sanji got the chance to. Show my brother more than I deem proper and no one will ever save you again, Yoi. He said, his blue eyes darkening as he stared down the man. I understand. He cringed under the weight of Marco's glare before looking at the laughing teenager. Ma. You can't be mean to my new friend. Hey, can you show me more of that weird thing you do? Luffy asked as Usopp and Chopper cheered along, wanting to see more. Of course, until my crew gets here to pick me up I can show you all you want. If you hadn't kicked him I would have, so you have my thanks. Sanji said, lighting a new smoke. It was nothing, just doing my job, Yoi. But he was starting to wonder if leaving Luffy alone was a good idea. The man continued to do his changes, making the trio laugh a lot, but Vivi's eyes widened when a face passed through that she would recognize anywhere, her father's. He transformed into my father. She whispered harshly to Nami, who was reading the paper and didn't look up at her words. I saw that. I've read enough news on Alabasta to know what the king looks like by now. She said, flipping to a new page. And you're not reacting to it? Vivi asked her as she finally looked up at her friend. Reacting will give them an edge, we want them to be at least a little surprised when we show up. Don't let them know this is bothering you, Vivi. She spoke with harsher words, but Vivi needed to calm down and collect herself before they got to her home. After a while of fooling around, the strange man's crew came and picked him up. I hope we meet again, my friends. He shouted to Luffy, who waved back happily, laughing. Now then, care to explain what's going on, Princess Vivi Yoi? Marco asked once the man had finally left. That man is another agent of Baroque Works Mr.2. Vivi clarified, bringing a shock throughout the crew and sadness to Luffy. And here I thought we could be friends too bad he was interesting, that guy. He pouted. You just want everyone to be your friend. Usopp grumbled as Luffy looked his way. And what's wrong with that? Before Usopp could open his mouth, it was Sanji who cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. You do realize that he can steal your appearances? Everyone except this guy here, beautiful Vivi, and myself were touched. He pointed his thumb towards Marco, who was giving Luffy a look he had come to associate with slight disappointment. Luffy hated it when Marco looked at him like that because it meant he had done something he should have known better than to do. Marco was giving the look because he had taught Luffy to be careful around strange people, especially ones that were pirates, but he sighed and gave the boy one of his fonder looks. You guys are walking into some dangerous problems. You really can't afford to be so casual with strange pirates, Yoi. He didn't feel dangerous, Luffy said quietly, looking up at Marco, who was watching him. He was weird, but I didn't feel any danger at all. He was trying to reason with the commander, though, so Luffy should have known better. Some people are better at hiding their danger, Lu, not everyone is as open and trusting as you are, Yoi. He can transform into anyone, right? It was Zoro who spoke first after the moment's silence. That's what he said. Nami added and Usopp nodded. He proved that to us as well. Chopper agreed with him. Then we'll need a way to know each other should we run into him again, a mark to prove that it really is us. A mark? Luffy asked as Zoro nodded, pulling out a marker and making an X on his arm and holding it up for them all to see. We'll all be wearing the same mark, but we'll hide it under cloth or something. If we ever need proof of who we are, we can just show our mark since that guy doesn't know about it. Zoro said as everyone looked at him in awe. What the hell is that look for? He growled at them as they smiled. Just wasn't expecting something that clever to come out of your shitty mouth. Sanji said as Zoro shot daggers at his rival. At least one of us says something right, dark brow. He said back, almost causing a fight. I don't need a mark. Luffy said, causally stopping them before Nami got up to beat the boys. And why's that? Chopper asked, confused. Because I've got this and the weird guy doesn't know about it. Luffy pulled up his shirt showing his tattoo off. When did you get that? Chopper put his hoofs on the lower back of his captain and examined the tattoo carefully. When I was 15, I think. He added as the reindeer's hooves froze. What's wrong, Chopper? Nami asked as the little guy marched himself in front of Luffy and glared at him. You idiot. He shouted, startling everyone. You don't like it? Luffy was disappointed. He thought everyone would like his special mark. 15 is way too young to get body art done. Your body isn't finished growing and there are so many risks involved on how it was done. Did you know about this, Marco? Chopper turned his gaze to the commander who had his arms crossed. If I had, he wouldn't have gotten it, Yoi. It was one of his moments he had wished Luffy had never left his sight. You should still get the mark, Luffy. Nami said as Luffy tilted his head in confusion. But I've got this mark, he said, but Nami shook her head. If our captain doesn't have a mark, they'll know it was some kind of plan. We need you to look like us as well, Luffy. But won't all of us having the same mark make them suspicious? Usopp asked hesitantly. Maybe, but most pirate crews have some sort of mark to show they are all of the same crew. You white-beard pirates with your tattoos, us with these bandages. It's the best plan I've ever heard come from Zoro. She said, crossing her arms and giving him a smirk. And what's that supposed to mean, witch? So we all get this mark to prove our friendship. Vivi said, taking the marker from Zoro and making the X on her forearm with pride. The mark of friendship, those words alone caught Luffy's attention as he held out his arm to her, letting her put the mark on him before passing the marker on to the others. To prove we are all friends. Sanji let out a puff of smoke and smiled as he to put the mark on his arm. It's a smart plan and it should work, Yoi. Marco said, looking at the small group of misfits who belonged under his son's flag. Ma. You too. Marco was ready to just refuse the mark, but Luffy's eyes meeting his own broke his will as he put his hand into the boy's, letting him make a large X on his forearm. Now you're one of us. Luffy said to him, and it was in a weird way. Marco belonged to his father's crew as one of his commanders, but the look in Luffy's eyes told him that no matter the distance, this small ship would always be a second home for his ma. We're finally here, Vivi said as they got closer and closer to Alabasta. Crocodile won't even know what hit him once we're done. Zoro said, helping to get the ship ready to land at the shore. We're here. Luffy shouted, making Nami slap him. White. We need to make a plan now, we can't just wander the island freely. She started, but Luffy was off and not even Marco could catch him. You've got to be shitting me. Sanji said, his curly brown twitching in annoyance. When I get my hands on him, Nami growled under her breath as Marco just sighed and sat down in the shade. You're not going after him? Zoro asked, surprised the commander hadn't gone after him in an instant. No need to, Yoi. He said casually as a little crowd began to form around him. Why not? Chopper asked. Because I made a promise and I have no choice but to keep it. He said, but that just confused everyone. I now see where Luffy got his cryptic ways from. Nami laughed as Sanji called them for some food. If you want to go find him though at all, I'll make you something to bring him. Sanji said at the galley door as Marco thanked him for his offer, but chose to have a small nap. The heat of this island felt good against him flames. Ace is here. Both Marco and Luffy whispered as the boy ran towards the familiar feeling of his brother. It had been way too long since he had last seen him. While the excited feeling he had of seeing Ace again, another feeling began to overtake him, one that he could not ignore no matter what. Hunger. Luffy was hungry. Lifting his nose to the sky, he took in all the different scents of the marketplace and followed the best one until he came crashing into a restaurant where the chef was placing plates of food on the counter for a muscular young adult who was glaring at a marine. Food. Luffy shouted, but his eyes caught Ace. For a split second Luffy hesitated on running to the wonderful scented food, but of course that was only for a moment. Wait, Luffy. Ace tried to yell, recognizing his brother and the slight hesitation in the boy's eyes before it was gone and replaced by the more feral look of hunger. Once Luffy got that look, however, there was no stopping him from getting what he wanted. Food now. Surprisingly to Ace, Luffy didn't knock him off his bench but took the seat next to him and stole his plates of food. Luffy? The Marine yelled, making Ace's brow twitch. No matter how long he had known the Marine, no one talked to Luffy like that in front of him. "Boy, watch that tone, Smokey, you're talking to my precious little brother," Ace said, but he didn't miss the sadness that crossed over Smoker's face as Smoker looked at Luffy. "Uncle Smokey. What are you doing here?" Luffy spat food in the Marine's face, but there wasn't even a drop of fear from the young pirate. "I've been searching for the both of you for quite a while, especially you, boy," he growled, but Luffy laughed, taking another bite, ignoring the pained expression on Smoker's face. "Do you see that those pirates are talking to the Marine like they're friends?" a customer whispered, making Smoker look around at the gossiping customers in the shop. "Thanks for the food, mister." Luffy had finished all the food and grabbed Ace by the wrist. "As great as this has been, I really gotta go, uncle, later," he shouted before bolting, dragging Ace behind him. "Boy, wait, Luffy. Hold up." Ace shouted, trying to remove his arm from Luffy's strong grip but found the boy had coated his palms in an invisible hockey, but it didn't feel right. "No time, Ma and the others are docked. Ugh, somewhere." He started to look around while coming to a complete stop. "You mean you don't know where your ship is?" Ace rubbed his wrist once Luffy had let him go but looked at the kid in disappointment. Luffy was getting tired of his brothers giving him looks like that. "Ma's with them, so I'm not worried." Luffy laughed and looked away, letting his smile drop slightly, but Ace shook his head regardless. "As a captain, it's your duty to always know where your crew is, Luffy, you can't just run off like a child anymore." He wanted to get one last scolding into the boy before Marco got to do it, and he knew Marco would do it. "Yeah, I know, but they're not very far, I can feel it," he said, ignoring Ace casually. "And what was your deal with Smoker back there?" Ace was confused by that small interaction. Ace remembered the summer spent with the Marine, but the pained look on Smoker's face threw him off. Did he really not expect Luffy to become a pirate? Who knows? Luffy gave Ace one of his smiles that meant he knew something, or worse, he was planning something, and when Luffy plans things, it never works out for the people involved. "Does your crew understand the danger you bring with you everywhere you go?" Ace asked Luffy, who punched his brother in the shoulder. "Asshole. Just saying. Look, see. They're over there." Luffy began to wave at the ship that was docked at the closest beach. "Do you really expect them to hear you from this far away?" Ace's sweat dropped, then paled as Luffy wrapped his arm around him multiple times. "You're right, we need to get closer." Ace was about to beg his brother to wait a moment, but it was far too late as Luffy launched them into the sky. The Straw Hat crew would have been surprised to see Luffy landing on their deck with to some of them a stranger, but were used to Luffy by now. "Hey guys, I'm back." He laughed as Marco walked up to him, giving Ace a hand to help him get up. "Give me a good reason I shouldn't drown you, Luffy." Ace growled, but Luffy looked at him all innocent-like and smiled. "Because you love me?" he asked as the fire user twitched. "Not quite good enough, come here you." Ace launched himself at Luffy, who bolted away from his brother. "Who are you?" Zoro asked, stepping in front of Ace, shielding Luffy. Ace was about to open his mouth and proudly state who he was to the Nakama present until a silver plate came crashing into the fire user's face. "I thought it was you making all that shitty noise, Ace. Food's ready," he said as Ace rubbed his face in annoyance. "Good to see you, to Sanji." "Come on, Ace, let's go eat." Luffy grabbed his brother's hand and tried to pull him towards the galley. "Not yet, Lu." He pulled his hand away as all Straw Hats, Princess and Marco looked at him now. "There are Marines scattered around this island, you guys should be careful," he said to them. Vivi nodded, understanding that the Civil War might have made a few Marines interested in helping the country even a little. "That's right, you're still thinking about Smokey," Luffy said, but Ace shook his head. "I've been here for a while, so I've had the chance to look around, and it's not looking good." He knew this country wasn't doing well, but the state it was in at this moment was worse than before. "Did you find him or any word of him, Yoi?" Marco asked Ace, who looked away. "If he was here, he must have left before I arrived. I got some word of where he might have been heading, but even that's sketchy at best," Ace said to them. "I don't mean to interrupt, but who are you?" Zoro asked, annoyed but interested in the man. "Name's Ace, Fire Fist Ace to be exact," he said and pointed to his large tattoo on his back, which calmed a few down. "He's my big brother," Luffy said happily. "So this is the big bother you talked about? So I'm guessing this is the swordsman you talked about?" "Yup," Luffy said to both questions. "Are we going to eat or not?" "A cold meal is a wasted meal," Sanji said to them as the Straw Hats finally moved to the galley. Marco held Ace back. "He's gone then?" Marco said, a frown on his face. "Yeah, meaning we shouldn't stick around long either. I've heard bad rumors about him," Ace said. "Like what, Yoi?" Like he's planning something big and needs a big name to help him do it. Ace crossed his arms and leaned on the wall. So you think he came here to ask Crocodile for help, Yoi? Marco asked Ace, who shook his head. No, I think he came to see if Crocodile was still floating around this place, and once he got his answer he left. So what is you this worried, Yoi? It doesn't feel right, something feels like it's going to all go wrong and Luffy's going to end up in the middle of it all. Ace said to Marco sadly. So what's the plan, Ace? I want to stick around with Luffy for a little bit longer, make sure he's alright and strong enough, then we'll continue on our search. You mean you want to make sure these people are alright and strong enough, Yoi? Marco clarified, making Ace smirk. Is there any difference anymore? I've been with them for a while, they're good kids, Yoi. I don't doubt that, Luffy chose them. Oi, you guys coming in or what? Sanji said he wants you to eat and he doesn't like people saying no to food. Luffy called from the door. We'll figure out a plan later, Yoi. Marco gave Ace a little shove towards the door where happy conversations were coming from. You're right, I've got a little brother to catch up with first. Marco stared at Ace, who was being pulled into the galley forcefully this time and pushed into a chair to be scolded by Sanji for being late for dinner. This ship's about to get a little more lively, Yoi. Marco chuckled before joining in with the others. This ship reminded him of home, so it wouldn't hurt for him and Ace to stay just a little longer. The conversations around the table were loud and filled with laughter, much to Marco's amusement and Ace's annoyance at times due to some of Luffy's stories. Nah, remember the time when he would begin and Marco would smile or frown depending on the story. No, that was clearly you that did that. Ace would pout as Nami smiled at him but silently stole from Ace's plate. Ace was too distracted to notice that one of his tempura shrimps had been stolen by the redhead. But that one time when you, oh wait, that was Thatch, wasn't it? Luffy asked Marco, who shrugged his shoulders, not knowing each prank the commander had pulled. Has Luffy yet given any of you the painted wall treatment, Yoi? Marco asked them, who looked confused. Ma. I grew out of that forever ago. Luffy pouted as Ace looked at Marco in confusion. The what treatment? His confusion brought more confusion to the others around them. The painted wall treatment, Yoi. Luffy scowled as Marco smirked. You were such a cranky feathery bastard, I had no other choice but to do it, and Thatch was the mastermind. He said as Marco laughed more. Really, Thatch you say? I was so sure that all those paint marks reached to about your height, Yoi. Not the ones on the ceiling. He defended himself as Ace looked at them fondly, their bond shining from the years of love. Are you going to explain this or what? He asked as Marco and Luffy looked at one another and laughed. No point if you've actually truly grown out of it, Yoi. He said as Luffy closed his eyes, smirking. Just for that I'll be reminding Thatch all of our special painting days. He opened his eyes, a spark of mischief there, maybe he can have the same fun again just without my help. I bet there's some new members who would love to ruffle your feathers. He smiled. No need, little brother, Thatch has enough fun as it is, without the help of others, thank you very much. Ace shook his head at the two of them, seeing how they had blocked everyone out but themselves and their own little jokes. Sorry about them. Ace pointed his thumb back towards Luffy and Marco, who were talking about something else and laughing. They're quite close, aren't they? Vivi asked, leaning on her hand, watching them, missing her father more and more. Almost makes me jealous. Usopp added. We'll be leaving soon, so please bear with it for now. You're leaving? Luffy asked, turning his head towards Ace, who looked up at Marco for a moment. Soon, but not quite yet, Yoi. We can't stay forever, Lu, we have our own work to do. Ace recognized a look in Luffy's eyes. It was the same look he gave when one of the siblings were going on a mission he couldn't go on. It sucked being the one to make him look like that, but Luffy had his place here now. Laughter filled the ship that night as a party was held to welcome Ace to the ship officially. You sure you don't want anything else, Ace? Usopp asked, taking a finished plate of food away from the fire user to bring to the galley. Nah, I'm alright. He waved the long-nosed boy off Marco sitting down next to him. You've been watching them, Yoi? He said, looking at the laughing crew but mostly at the laughing Luffy. Am I that obvious? Just a bit. Marco smiled as Ace shook his head. Marco turned his eyes towards Zoro, who was watching them just as strongly as Ace was watching the crew. He's so carefree, all of them are really, but he's acting like Ace started looking at Luffy, put some chopsticks in his nose and begin a weird dance Ace remembered teaching him. Like he's not probably going into a fight fairly soon, Yoi. Marco finished wondering which person he needed to kill for teaching Luffy to dance like that. Exactly. Ace said as a cold glass of some sort of drink was placed beside him by Sanji. That's because he isn't thinking like that. Luffy is Luffy whether he's fighting a battle or dancing with his friends. No matter what happens, we'll be there to support him in anything he does. Sanji left Ace speechless for a moment before he smiled. There's something, aren't they, Yoi? I'll never say that to Sanji, but yeah, I guess they are. The party finished off with everyone sleeping wherever they fell, while Nami closed her door, locking the noisy boys out while she went to her own room. "So, when are we going to beat Crocodile?" Luffy asked at breakfast, casually making a few tired and hungover pirates eye. "Don't be so excited, Luffy, we have a little while to go before we get to the capital." Why can't he just come to us?" Luffy complained while Marco bopped him on the head, catching his attention. "You can't be saying you don't want to go on an adventure, Yoi?" he asked Luffy, who shook his head rapidly. "Of course not, just hate the sand and heat." He put his chin on the table, thinking angry thoughts at the heat. "You'll need plenty of water for this trip and to change into proper clothing as well, Yoi," Marco said to those who were listening. "We're already good on the clothing." Nami smiled, holding some clothes in her arms and placing a few around the boys' normal seats. "And I've got the water and lunches covered for now." Sanji blew out some smoke and waved, going to do his job of preparing the meals. "Then we should all get into proper clothing as well." Marco smiled, taking the clothes offered to him from Nami. "Why do we need to put on these things?" Usopp asked, picking up a long-sleeved long shirt. "It will help to keep the sun off you during the day and keep you warm at night," Vivi said, coming back to the galley in her own clothes. "It's a desert island though," Usopp mumbled, but began to walk towards the door. "Yes, but the temperatures drop to near freezing at night time, so you'll need the layers to keep warm then," she said as he nodded, leaving to put on his own clothes. "Come on, Luffy, let's get going." Ace all but pushed Luffy to his feet to get him to get changed as the boys moved to the men's quarters to put their clothes on. Ace, Luffy started once he had thrown on his new clothes. Man. What's going to happen when you find stupid face?" he asked his brother, who tried not to laugh at the nickname given to Blackbeard. "We'll punish him in the ways of a pirate, Lu." He was changing into his own clothes as well as Marco. "Yeah, but what then?" he asked the older two, stopping and looking at Luffy, not sure what he was going on about. "Luffy?" Marco asked, but the boy turned his eyes up towards Marco and Ace sternly as Luffy could really get. "Once you've beaten Blackbeard guy, then what? Another person's going to cross my path and want to take me out. If I can't handle that guy, then you guys will help, then another will take his place." Luffy wasn't smiling as he tilted his hat, covering his eyes. "There's always going to be someone stronger waiting in the shadows for their turn to fight me. Are you guys going to come to my rescue each time? Peach isn't like any other guys you'll come to face, Luffy." Ace tried to reassure his brother, but Luffy gave his blank face to his brothers. "What if I decided to go after the four emperors? Would you back me up then?" he asked them as Ace looked towards Marco, who was silent, his blue eyes searching through Luffy's dark and overshadowed eyes. He searched blue, meeting a darker brown. He was unable to properly read them like he usually could. Luffy, Ace started, but Luffy lifted his hat up, his hand on the back of his head, and began to laugh. "I'm just joking, but seriously, I needed to see just how far you'd go. Deal with stupid guy, but let me handle my own enemies, okay?" he asked his brothers, who were still speechless as the boy ran out of the room to rejoin his crew. "You don't think he was really serious, do you?" Ace whispered to Marco, who looked towards the door, his own face lazy and expressionless. "I don't know, Yoi, I really don't." X. The walk through the desert was not fun for Luffy as the heat beamed down on his rubbery body, making him feel like he might melt. "This sucks," he complained for what felt like the 1,000th time to his crew. "We know." Nami nearly growled as Vivi smiled at them in sympathy. "This place isn't good for people who have never been here." She sighed, but Luffy put his finger up in the air to make a point. "I've been here before and it sucked then and still sucks now." Then he dropped his hand as the energy drained from him. "Vivi, can we have some more water now?" Luffy asked her as she gave an exasperated smile, knowing that she couldn't really say no to Luffy when he was looking at her like that. "Just a sip, we still have quite a way to go still before we can rest," she said carefully to Luffy, who was ready to down the whole jug. She said just a sip, Luffy. Marco warned his little brother, who opened his mouth and closed it, looking back at Marco, who was giving one of his parent looks that Luffy loved and hated. "Fine," he drawled out, taking the said sip and looking back at the man, who nodded, then frowned as Luffy took another and another. "That's enough." Sanji growled as Luffy chuckled while passing back the half-empty water jug. "Shitty captain." He grumbled, lighting up a new smoke as they continued until the sun had set. "We should all get some sleep, we need to keep moving tomorrow," Vivi said, unrolling a blanket from the supplies they had brought with them. Everyone had settled down except for one, Luffy. "Close your eyes, Luffy, and try and sleep." Zoro grumbled, not liking that Luffy's nervous energy was keeping him awake. Was all he said as he wrapped the blanket around himself and sat down beside Zoro, who was lying on his back looking up at the stars. "Talk already," he said shortly, knowing Luffy probably had something on his mind. "I think I said something I shouldn't have today." He looked up at the stars as well, waiting for Zoro to ask him what he said. Was it the truth? The question caught Luffy off guard slightly, so he chuckled. Man, I think it was. Then does it matter? You were going to say it sooner or later, so why question it? He asked Luffy, who smiled. The emperors are strong. He said to Zoro, who closed his eyes, giving his trademark smirk. Then let's get stronger. Right. Thanks, Zoro. Shut up and sleep. Zoro let the sleep fall on him easily, but Luffy continued to look at the stars. You guys can't keep protecting me forever, ma, let me do this my own way. Flopping back into the sand and digging himself a comfortable little hole, Luffy fell asleep beside his best friend. Wake up, Luffy, we need to keep moving. Ace was standing over Luffy as the boy rubbed his eyes. Too hot. Were the first things he said, making Ace sigh. You stink as well, as soon as we find water you're bathing in it, don't give me that look. He added as Luffy scowled. I don't smell that bad. You smell worse than when you returned from your training with Mihawk. He added as Luffy stood up, lifting his arm in the air and smelling. I do smell. He added easily before laughing and walking away. Training with Mihawk. Zoro was beside Ace, giving the man a look and crossing his arms. Long story, get Lu to tell you about it sometime. He sighed and followed Luffy, who was laughing with the others. Where's the next stop? Marco asked Vivi, who pulled out a map and looked over it. If it survived, the next place we should get to is a small oasis called Yuba. She said, frowning, old memories flashing in her mind as she closed the map and looked at Marco, tears forming in her eyes before she blinked them away. Then we should keep moving, Yoi. Luffy looked around him at the sands blowing and felt a deep sense of sadness for this island and all it has been going through. He cared for Vivi and she cared for her people, but was it enough for her to really help them? Let's get going. Luffy said softly before putting his smirk back on and running off towards the open sands. I might get whiplash from his mood swings. Ace grumbled but smiled regardless. You get used to it pretty quickly. Zoro yawned, walking past everyone towards Luffy to keep a close eye on him in case something happened, which something usually did. They shouldn't wander off like that, they'll get lost. Vivi cried out as Marco sighed, following behind the swordsman. Zoro just needs to move and he'll get lost. Usopp sighed and the others followed behind Marco, and while they followed as close as they could, some way or another Luffy, Zoro, Chopper and Marco ended up lost. Where'd everyone go? Luffy asked, suddenly looking back, making Marco freeze mid-step and look behind him as well. They probably got lost. Zoro scoffed, but Marco knew it was the other way around. It's hot. Luffy complained, dropping into the sand to pant. We know, Luffy, look, I'll go up and see if I can see them. Marco sighed and pushed his usually well-groomed hair out of his face, wiping sweat off him at the same time. Just stay where you are, Chopper, I'm leaving them to you, since you seem to be the most responsible here, Yoi. Marco said and took off before Zoro and Luffy could object. Why's Ma so mad? Luffy asked from his spot in the sand as he watched a phoenix fly up and look around. Who knows? Zoro yawned as Luffy lifted his head and looked around. Water, he yelled, jumping up and running towards a cactus and breaking it open to see the liquid inside. Wait, Luffy, you shouldn't do that. Chopper yelled, but it was too late as the teenager drank the water down, his eyes slowly starting to lose focus. Luffy? Chopper asked Zoro, standing beside the reindeer, just watching as Luffy turned to face them, a blank look on his face. Feel better now, idiot? Zoro asked and was about to smile until Luffy's face turned into a growl he had never really seen on Luffy, so reacting on instinct, he hit Luffy in the head, knocking him to the ground before sitting on him. Marco's going to kill us, isn't he? Chopper asked as Zoro looked up at Chopper, who was shaking his head as Luffy thrashed in the sand. I left you all alone for a moment, Yoi. Marco sounded disappointed, but Zoro turned on him, silver eyes flashing dangerously. You know, it takes only a short second for Luffy to get into trouble. He growled, reminding the commander that Luffy did what he wanted no matter who was near him. I found them, we're not that far away. Marco sighed and looked at his raging little brother, who was yelling louder. That's enough, Luffy, Yoi. And like that, Luffy was silent and sleepy. What did you do to him? Zoro asked, getting off the boy who was now sleeping in the sand. Saved us some trouble, we can't stay lost long, this place will kill the weak and I don't exactly want to die here, Yoi. Marco said, then looked at Chopper, who was panting heavily. I know this place isn't kind to you as well, thank you for being strong. Marco praised those who tried, and this little reindeer was doing his best. Shut up, bastard, I don't need any of your praises. Chopper said, but the grin on his face and the way he was slightly moving showed his true feelings. Marco liked this little guy and appreciated him taking care of Luffy, no matter the troubles given to him for it. Will Lu be alright, Yoi? He pointed to his little brother, who was now snoring away on Zoro's back. He'll sleep off the juice and be back to trouble in no time at all. Zoro sighed but held a tight grip on his captain. But I'm trusting you to take care of him, Yoi. Just as Marco and Zoro grinned at each other, Chopper collapsed from heat exhaustion. I guess I'll carry him, the others aren't too far ahead of us, I know the way. Marco picked a small reindeer up and carried him much the way he used to carry Luffy. He could almost close his eyes and picture it, the little boy holding his brother tightly weighing barely anything. Luffy said something to me, Yoi. He wasn't sure why he was bringing it up, but he felt he needed to. He did, didn't he? Zoro wasn't going to betray his captain no matter who it was. Marco thought about this before stopping and turning to face the vice captain. Don't be foolish, the emperors are out of your league. He was being harsh, but he was protective of what was his and Luffy, and this crew were his to protect. Then maybe they should hurry up and get in ours. Luffy will do what he wants with or without your permission, and telling him no is near challenging him to do it anyway. If they or anyone else threatens my captain, I will make them regret it, even if I need to kill them for it. His silver eyes gleamed like the blades. He was so proud of Marco, pitied the man who got on his bad side. You sound like you're above the emperors, and that can get you killed here. Be cautious and wait, it will protect you longer, Yoi. He meant well, but Luffy knew how to pick the most stubborn to be his friends. Waiting gets us nowhere, we will act as we please, are we not pirates? Zoro scoffed, but Marco wasn't taking any of it. We are pirates, but you've only just entered the Grand Line. There are people here who are stronger than you and even stronger than Luffy. If word gets out where Luffy was raised, that won't stop them from trying to kill him, and even you. Grow in strength, then take on the emperors if you still wish for that. Marco knew this man would do anything to protect Luffy, in fact the whole crew would, but going up against people like Pops was ridiculous for the strength they had right now. This crew still needed to grow. You can stop worrying, mother, we don't plan on challenging them yet. Zoro nearly laughed at Marco's expression. But Luffy said. Luffy was giving you his warning. That doesn't mean he's stupid enough to actually do it yet. He may look and act like an idiot, but underneath all that he's been planning it all out. Zoro looked to the side to see the sleeping face of Luffy blowing a snot bubble. Really? Marco too looked at the boy. Don't forget from where you came, him and I and everyone on our crew will get stronger. They had continued walking in silence as Marco took in everything that had been said. When they finally reached the group again, Ace stomped right up to sleeping Luffy and punched him in the head, waking him up. Ouch. He cried out, grabbing the growing bump and giving Ace a glare. What the hell was that for? Huh? Where are we? He looked around as Nami was scowling, being held back by Vivi. Usopp and Sanji were shaking their heads and sighed. Wander off like that again, and we're getting you boys a leash. Nami growled from behind Ace. We're close to you, but we just have a little while left to go. Vivi tried to calm everyone down, but Luffy laughed and apologized for wandering off, swearing he won't do it again. Right, they'll stay put when the sea dries up. Sanji sighed, lighting up a new smoke. Marco watched them all regroup as if they had never been separated from each other. It's time for us to go, Yoi. He said, stunning everyone including Ace. What? Ma, you guys just got here, why are you leaving? Luffy's eyes were a little panicked. He had gotten used to having Ace and Marco on this adventure. We have important work to do, Luffy, we can't continue to be sidetracked. Ace, it's time we moved on. Ace nodded, knowing the time to leave would be soon. Have your adventure, Lu, we'll be close by if you really need us. He smiled a bit as Luffy fought back a pout. The two of us will be together, but should you need to find us again, take this. Marco pulled a Viver card out of his pocket, tore a piece off and passed it to Luffy. I have one of these from Ace. He remembered placing it in his hat before leaving the Moby Dick. Yeah, but now you have one from me in case anything happens. Not that anything is going to happen, Lu, don't give me that look, Yoi. Luffy frowned but took the piece of card anyways, putting it right beside Ace and Sabo's in his hat. I'm impressed by all of you, you're a great team, I can't wait to see you all in the new world, Yoi. Marco bowed to them, making a few of them bow back in embarrassment. It's not every day we get to meet the first commander of an emperor's crew, the pleasure was all ours. Nami lifted herself out of the bow and smiled at Marco, the man who helped save both her Luffy life not that long ago. She owed the commander. Take care of him for us, I know he can be a pain, but he's still my baby brother. Everyone nodded as Luffy stepped forward, grabbing Ace's hand. I won't lose to you, Ace. Ace smiled. Keep rising, Luffy, we're all waiting for you at the top. Zoro looked at Marco, they both locked eyes knowing they'd meet again. The amount of love they held for the boy captain ensured that. Be my eyes while I'm gone, I'll be counting on you, brother. Marco and Zoro gripped hands, grinning at one another. Ace and Marco left waving goodbye as the small crew continued their way to Yuba. I'm going to miss them. Ace sighed, pulling his hat on stronger as the wind picked up. We'll see them again, but we have work to do. Taking a deep breath, Marco turned himself into the phoenix he was and waited for Ace to get on his back. I feel honored. He laughed as Marco lifted off into the air. I'm sick and tired of being lost now, where is your little ship? That is it for now. Please like and subscribe for more.